I never imagined that missing my brother's rehearsal dinner because I was saving someone's life in the operating room would lead to me being seated behind a concrete pillar at his wedding, treated like an unwelcome afterthought. But when the bride's father stood up during his speech and locked eyes with me across that crowded reception hall, everything changed in ways I could never have predicted. Sometimes the people who matter most see your worth when everyone else chooses to look away. What happened next didn't just transform that wedding day. It completely shifted how I understood my place in my own family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Emily Chen, and I've spent the last 8 years of my life learning to save hearts, literally. After completing my residency at Johns Hopkins and my cardiothoracic surgery fellowship at Stanford, I returned to Portland to work at St. Mary's Medical Center. Most people hear heart surgeon and imagine prestige, respect, maybe even a little glamour. The reality is 18-hour days, hands that shake from exhaustion, and missing every important family event because someone's life hangs in the balance. My brother Michael never quite understood this. 3 years younger than me, he followed a more traditional path through college, landing a comfortable software development job that offered regular hours, predictable schedules, and the luxury of planning ahead. While I was memorizing cardiac anatomy and perfecting suture techniques, Michael was building a social life, dating casually, and eventually meeting Jessica Martinez at a friend's birthday party. Jessica worked as a dental hygienist, came from a large, close-knit Latino family, and possessed the kind of warmth that drew people to her like flowers turning toward sunlight. She laughed easily, remembered everyone's birthdays, and had strong opinions about the importance of family dinner every Sunday. From the moment Michael introduced her to our parents, it was clear she represented everything they had hoped I might become: warm, available, focused on relationships rather than career advancement. Our parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan when I was 2 years old. They built a modest life through hard work and sacrifice, Dad managing a small accounting firm while Mom worked part-time at a local library. They were proud of my achievements, certainly, but I could sense their concern about my chosen path. Surgery demanded everything, leaving little room for the traditional markers of success they valued: marriage, children, regular family gatherings, where everyone could count on your presence. The tension had been building gradually over the years. Missed birthday dinners because of emergency surgeries, Christmas mornings spent at the hospital checking on post-operative patients. The time, I had to leave Mom's retirement party early when a trauma case came in. Each absence was justified, necessary even, but they accumulated like small wounds that never quite healed. When Michael announced his engagement to Jessica 18 months ago, I genuinely felt happy for him. They complemented each other beautifully, his steady reliability balancing her spontaneous energy. The engagement party, held at our parents' house in Beaverton, had been a joyful celebration. I managed to attend, having specifically requested that weekend off months in advance. Jessica's family welcomed me warmly that day. Her parents, Robert and Carmen Martinez, were gracious hosts who insisted I try Carmen's homemade tamales and asked thoughtful questions about my work. Robert, a construction foreman with calloused hands and a ready laugh, seemed particularly interested in hearing about life-saving procedures. Carmen, who managed the office for a local pediatric practice, understood the demands of healthcare and expressed admiration for my dedication. The problems began during the wedding planning process. Jessica, with her natural inclination toward inclusive celebration, initially wanted to involve me in various pre-wedding activities. She asked if I would be interested in helping choose flowers, joining the bachelorette party planning committee, or at least attending the venue tastings. Each invitation came with genuine enthusiasm, but I had to decline repeatedly due to surgery schedules, medical conferences, and the unpredictable nature of cardiac emergencies. My absences were always professionally justified, but I began to notice a shift in how Jessica's family responded to me at subsequent gatherings. Where once there had been warm curiosity about my career, I now sensed a cooler assessment. Carmen began making comments about the importance of work-life balance. Jessica's sister Maria would ask pointed questions about whether I planned to prioritize family once I got married someday. Even Robert, initially so supportive, started making jokes about doctors thinking they were more important than everyone else. The real turning point came 6 weeks before the wedding. Michael and Jessica had organized a family dinner to finalize wedding details, specifically requesting that everyone attend since major decisions needed group input. I confirmed my attendance, blocked the evening on my calendar, and even arranged for a colleague to cover my on-call responsibilities. Then, 20 minutes before I was supposed to leave the hospital, a 62-year-old man was rushed into our emergency department following a massive heart attack. The on-call surgeon was already in another operating room with a pediatric case that couldn't be interrupted. The man's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I was the only cardiac surgeon available. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I called Michael to explain the situation, promised I would join them as soon as the surgery was complete, and scrubbed in for what turned out to be a 7-hour procedure. By the time I finished, having successfully performed a quadruple bypass, that saved the man's life. The family dinner had long since concluded. Michael was understanding, as he always tried to be, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice when I called to apologize. More concerning was the silence that followed when I asked what decisions had been made in my absence. Apparently, Jessica had wanted my input on the seating arrangements, hoping I might suggest which family friends I'd most enjoy sitting with during the reception. Since I wasn't there to participate, they had simply assigned me a seat and moved on. The rehearsal dinner presented another scheduling conflict. Scheduled for Friday evening at the Willamette Room, it was meant to be an intimate gathering of immediate family and the wedding party. Once again, I had requested the time off well in advance, confirmed my attendance, and even purchased a new dress specifically for the occasion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Friday afternoon brought an emergency case that would haunt my dreams for weeks afterward. A 16-year-old girl, star of her high school soccer team, collapsed during practice with sudden cardiac arrest. Her parents, frantic with terror, begged me to save their daughter. The surgery required delicate precision, working around scar tissue from a childhood procedure most surgeons would have considered inoperable. I texted Michael from the scrub room, explaining that I was fighting to save a teenager's life and would join the rehearsal dinner as soon as possible. The procedure took 4 hours. When I finally emerged, exhausted but victorious, the girl's parents were weeping with relief. Their daughter would not only live, but return to competitive athletics within 6 months. I arrived at the Willamette Room just as the dinner was concluding, still wearing scrubs under my hastily thrown-on blazer. The private dining room buzzed. With laughter and conversation, everyone relaxed from good food and wine. Michael spotted me first, his expression mixing relief at my arrival with frustration at my timing. Jessica looked stunning in a navy dress that complemented her dark hair perfectly. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all of them laughing at some shared story. When she noticed me standing awkwardly in the doorway, her smile dimmed slightly, though she maintained her gracious demeanor. I apologized profusely, explaining about the emergency surgery, the teenager whose life had hung in the balance, the impossibility of leaving mid-procedure. Most people nodded politely, offering understanding murmurs about the demands of my profession. But I caught the eye rolls from some of Jessica's relatives, the whispered comments about priorities and commitment. Carmen Martinez approached me while I was getting a plate of food from the remaining buffet selections. She was polite but pointed in her remarks about how family events required sacrifices, how showing up mattered more than perfect excuses. Robert, who had been so friendly at previous gatherings, barely acknowledged my presence, focusing instead on animated conversation with Michael about weekend fishing plans. The worst moment came when Jessica's grandmother, Abuela Sofia, pulled me aside. This tiny woman, barely reaching my shoulder, looked up at me with eyes that had witnessed decades of family celebrations and disappointments. In heavily accented English, she told me that family loyalty was earned through presence, not accomplishments. That Jessica deserved a sister-in-law who understood the importance of being there when it mattered. Her words stung because they carried an element of truth I couldn't entirely dismiss. I had missed multiple events, made promises I couldn't keep, prioritized my career over family relationships in ways that created genuine hurt. But I also knew that my absences weren't casual choices or selfish priorities. They were the cost of a profession that demanded everything, where walking away meant someone might die. Michael found me on the hotel terrace afterward, staring out at the Willamette River while city lights reflected off the water. He sat beside me on the stone ledge, not speaking for several minutes. Finally, he said he understood my situation, that he was proud of what I accomplished, but that Jessica's family was starting to see me as someone who didn't value their daughter's happiness. I wanted to argue, to explain that saving lives was exactly how I showed I valued happiness, that every successful surgery meant some family wouldn't experience the devastation of loss. But sitting there with Portland's skyline glittering before us, I realized that explanations couldn't bridge the fundamental gap between my world and theirs. The wedding morning arrived with Oregon's characteristic early summer sunshine, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony at Riverside Gardens Event Center. I had purchased a beautiful sage green dress, appropriate for the garden setting, and taken extra care with my appearance. After years of minimal makeup and hair pulled back for surgical caps, I wanted to look like someone who belonged at this celebration. I arrived at the venue 30 minutes early, hoping to find Michael and offer any last-minute support he might need. The grounds were spectacular, with careful landscaping creating intimate spaces connected by stone pathways. White chairs were arranged in perfect rows, facing an arbor draped with climbing roses and ivy. Staff members moved efficiently, making final adjustments to floral arrangements and checking sound system connections. Michael was in the groom's preparation room, adjusting his bow tie with hands that trembled slightly from nervousness. His best man Tyler was attempting to calm him with increasingly ridiculous jokes, while the other groomsmen offered contradictory advice about wedding day survival. When Michael saw me, his face lit up with genuine happiness. Whatever tensions had existed during the planning process seemed forgotten in the joy of his wedding day. He hugged me tightly, telling me how much it meant that I was there, how he couldn't imagine celebrating without his sister present. We talked for 20 minutes about his hopes for married life, his gratitude for finding Jessica, his excitement about the honeymoon trip to Italy. For those moments, we recaptured the easy closeness we'd shared growing up, when my career ambitions were just dreams and family relationships seemed uncompromisingly solid. The ceremony was beautiful, held in the garden's central courtyard with Mount Hood visible in the distance. Jessica looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, altered to fit her perfectly. Michael's voice cracked with emotion as he recited vows he had written himself, promising to love Jessica through every challenge and celebration life might bring. I found myself genuinely moved by their exchange, remembering why I had chosen such a demanding career path in the first place. Every life I saved meant someone got to experience moments like this, surrounded by love and possibility. The teenagers, whose hearts I repaired, would have their own wedding days, their own children, their own chances to build meaningful lives. After the ceremony, guests moved to the cocktail hour while the wedding party took photographs. I mingled politely, introducing myself to Jessica's extended family and college friends. Most were friendly enough, asking about my work with the kind of polite interest people show for careers they don't quite understand. It was during this cocktail hour that I first noticed the seating arrangement for dinner would be problematic. A staff member approached me discreetly, checking my name against a clipboard and asking me to follow her to see my assigned table. We walked through the beautifully decorated reception hall, past tables adorned with centerpieces of white hydrangeas and greenery, toward the back corner of the room. My assigned seat was at a small table positioned directly behind one of the venue's structural concrete pillars. The pillar was decorated with trailing ivy and fairy lights, an attempt to incorporate the architectural necessity into the aesthetic design, but it still blocked most of the view toward the head table where Michael and Jessica would be seated. The other people at my table were Jessica's great aunt, who was nearly deaf, her cousin's teenage son, who clearly didn't want to be there, and two family friends I had never met. It was obviously the table for people who needed to be invited, but weren't central to the celebration, the polite equivalent of being seated in a different room entirely. I stood there for a moment, looking at the place card with my name written in elegant calligraphy, understanding exactly what message was being communicated. Despite being Michael's only sibling, despite my professional accomplishments, despite years of trying to maintain family relationships around an impossible schedule, I had been categorized as peripheral to this celebration. The hurt was immediate and sharp, but what followed was something I hadn't expected. A sense of clarity about my place in these family dynamics. All my efforts to apologize for my absences, to explain the demands of my career, to somehow earn acceptance for choices that had saved dozens of lives had been insufficient. I would always be the sister who wasn't present enough, the daughter who chose career over family, the person whose priorities didn't align with traditional expectations. I remained at that table during dinner, making polite conversation with my table mates while watching the celebration unfold from behind the concrete pillar. I could see portions of the head table when I leaned to one side, catch glimpses of Michael and Jessica laughing with their wedding party, observe the joy that filled the room even as I felt increasingly separate from it. What I couldn't see, what I had no way of knowing as I sat there feeling invisible and excluded, was that everything was about to change in the most unexpected way possible. The man who would transform my understanding of my own worth was sitting, just 3 tables away, preparing to give a father of the bride speech that would reveal a connection none of us had anticipated. The weeks leading up to Michael's wedding had been particularly challenging at St. Mary's Medical Center. Our cardiac unit was understaffed due to budget cuts, and the remaining surgeons were handling increased caseloads that pushed everyone to their limits. I was averaging 4 major surgeries per week, consulting on countless other cases, and mentoring residents who needed constant guidance to develop their skills safely. Dr. Patricia Williams, our department head, had pulled me aside the previous month to discuss my performance, not because it was lacking, but because she was concerned about my well-being. She pointed out that I hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years, that my colleagues were noticing signs of burnout, and that even the most dedicated surgeons needed time to recharge. I appreciated her concern, but I also knew that cardiac surgery didn't pause for personal maintenance. Every week brought new patients whose lives depended on our expertise, families whose worlds would shatter if we weren't available when crisis struck. The responsibility felt sacred, even when it came at personal cost. During those final weeks before the wedding, I treated a variety of cases that reminded me why I had chosen this specialty. There was Margaret Thompson, a 74-year-old grandmother whose heart valve replacement allowed her to dance at her granddaughter's quinceañera. James Rodriguez, a 38-year-old teacher whose bypass surgery meant he could return to his classroom and continue inspiring students. Each successful procedure reinforced my conviction that missing family dinners and social events was a worthwhile sacrifice. The most challenging case came just 5 days before Michael's wedding. A 45-year-old woman named Sandra Walsh was brought to our emergency department after collapsing at her son's baseball game. Her husband, frantic with worry, explained that Sandra had been experiencing chest pain for weeks, but had delayed seeking treatment because she was afraid of what doctors might find. Sandra's condition was complex, requiring a combination of bypass surgery and valve repair that would take most experienced surgeons 6 to 7 hours to complete. Her heart muscle had been damaged by months of restricted blood flow, making the procedure technically demanding and emotionally draining. I spent 12 hours in that operating room, working with a team of dedicated professionals to give Sandra another chance at life. When I finally emerged from surgery, Sandra's husband and teenage son were waiting in the family consultation room. The relief in their eyes when I told them the procedure had been successful reminded me why I endured the exhaustion, the isolation, and the constant pressure. Sandra would need months of recovery, but she would live to see her son graduate from high school, attend his college graduation, and hopefully celebrate many more family milestones. These were the moments that sustained me through the loneliness of my chosen path. While other people my age were building romantic relationships, starting families, and creating traditional support networks, I was learning to find fulfillment in the profound privilege of healing hearts. It wasn't a choice everyone would make, but it felt authentic to who I was and what I could contribute to the world. Michael understood this about me, at least intellectually. During our childhood, he had watched me care for injured animals, spending hours nursing a bird with a broken wing back to health, or researching treatment options for our neighbor's sick dog. My compassion had always manifested through action rather than words, through doing rather than simply feeling. Surgery was the ultimate expression of that instinct, the opportunity to literally hold someone's life in my hands and fight for their survival. Jessica's family, however, seemed to interpret my dedication differently. They saw someone who prioritized work over relationships, who used professional obligations as excuses to avoid family commitments. The cultural differences between our families became more apparent as the wedding approached. The Martinez family valued presence, emotional availability, and shared experiences. They measured love through time spent together, through consistent participation in celebrations and struggles alike. I tried to bridge this gap by sending thoughtful gifts, remembering important dates, and making efforts to connect when my schedule allowed. I sent Carmen flowers on Mother's Day with a card expressing gratitude for welcoming me into their family. I called Robert on his birthday, even though I was between surgeries and could only talk for a few minutes. I offered to help with wedding expenses, knowing that cardiac surgeons earn significantly more than construction foremen and dental hygienists. These gestures were appreciated, but didn't seem to compensate for my physical absence at key moments. The Martinez family appeared to operate on the principle that showing up was the fundamental requirement for meaningful relationships. Everything else, gifts, phone calls, financial contributions, felt secondary to the basic act of being present when family gathered. The tension reached its peak during Jessica's bridal shower, held at Carmen's sister's house in Southeast Portland. I had managed to arrange my surgery schedule to attend, arriving with an expensive gift and genuine enthusiasm for celebrating Jessica's upcoming marriage. The afternoon began pleasantly enough, with traditional shower games and delicious food prepared by Jessica's aunts and cousins. However, as the afternoon progressed, I began to notice subtle exclusions from conversations and activities. When the women shared stories about their own weddings and marriage advice, I was pointedly ignored despite being the only person present, with an advanced degree and professional experience that might offer unique perspectives. When they discussed plans for supporting Jessica during her first year of marriage, no one asked for my input or seemed interested in my potential contributions. The most painful moment came when Jessica's maid of honor, Rachel Kim, led a discussion about what makes a good sister-in-law. The women around the room shared their experiences, offering advice about maintaining family relationships and supporting each other through various challenges. When the conversation naturally turned to me, there was an uncomfortable silence before Rachel diplomatically changed the subject. I left that shower understanding that I had been evaluated and found wanting according to standards I couldn't meet, without fundamentally changing who I was. The Martinez family had decided that my career dedication made me unsuitable as a true family member, someone who could be counted on when support was needed most. This judgment felt particularly unfair because my work involved providing support in the most critical circumstances imaginable. But apparently saving strangers' lives didn't translate into family loyalty in their assessment. The night before Michael's wedding, I found myself questioning whether I should attend at all. Sitting in my downtown loft apartment, surrounded by medical journals and surgical textbooks, I considered how my presence might create tension that would detract from Michael and Jessica's celebration. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if I gracefully withdrew, claiming a last-minute emergency that would excuse my absence. But the thought of missing my only brother's wedding felt unbearable. Despite our recent tensions, Michael and I shared a bond forged through childhood adventures, academic challenges, and our parents' expectations. He had supported my decision to pursue medicine, even when it meant I couldn't attend his high school graduation because of college finals. He had visited me during residency, bringing care packages and encouragement when the pressure felt overwhelming. He deserved to have his sister present for the most important day of his life. I spent that evening preparing for the wedding with unusual care, selecting a dress that complemented the garden setting while remaining appropriately modest. I practiced conversations I might have with Jessica's relatives, preparing responses to questions about my work that would sound engaging rather than defensive. I even researched topics that might interest Robert, hoping to find common ground, despite our vastly different professional experiences. The morning of the wedding, I woke early and went for a run along the Willamette River, trying to clear my mind and prepare emotionally for what promised to be a challenging day. The city was just beginning to stir, early commuters heading to weekend shifts while runners and cyclists enjoyed the peaceful morning atmosphere. The familiar rhythm of my footsteps on the riverside path helped calm my anxiety and reinforce my determination to make the day special for Michael and Jessica. Arriving at Riverside Gardens Event Center, I was struck again by the venue's natural beauty. The gardens had been meticulously maintained, creating an almost fairy tale setting. For the ceremony, white roses climbed trellises throughout the property, their fragrance mixing with the scent of lavender and jasmine that bordered the walking paths. It was exactly the kind of romantic location Jessica had dreamed about, and I felt genuinely happy that Michael could provide this perfect beginning to their married life. The ceremony itself was flawless, a carefully orchestrated celebration that reflected both families' love for the couple. Michael looked handsome and confident in his classic black tuxedo, while Jessica was radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace gown. Their vows were personal and heartfelt, bringing tears to many guests' eyes as they promised to support each other through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. I found myself deeply moved by their commitment, remembering the young boy who used to follow me around our neighborhood, asking endless questions about everything from why leaves changed color to how airplanes stayed in the sky. Now he was promising to build a life with someone who clearly adored him, someone who would encourage his dreams and share his adventures. Despite the family tensions surrounding the wedding, I felt proud of the man my little brother had become. During the cocktail hour following the ceremony, I made genuine efforts to connect with Jessica's extended family and friends. I spoke with her college roommates about their careers in education and social work, finding common ground in our shared commitment to serving others. I complimented her aunts on the beautiful flowers they had arranged, asking questions about their gardening techniques with sincere interest. I even managed a pleasant conversation with Abuela Sofia about her immigration experience from Mexico, drawing parallels to my own parents' journey from Taiwan. These interactions felt positive and natural, giving me hope that perhaps the previous tensions had been temporary misunderstandings rather than fundamental incompatibilities. Jessica's family seemed more relaxed and welcoming in the celebratory atmosphere, and I began to think that my concerns about fitting in might have been overblown. It wasn't until the reception dinner began that I discovered how wrong I had been. Following the staff member to my assigned table behind the concrete pillar, I realized that my place in the family hierarchy had been made explicitly clear through the seating arrangement. This wasn't an oversight or a space constraint. It was a deliberate statement about my importance to the celebration. Sitting at that isolated table, partially hidden from the main festivities, I watched the reception unfold with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The other guests at my table were pleasant enough, but conversation was limited by our lack of shared connections and the awkward positioning that made us feel separate from the main celebration. I found myself observing rather than participating, studying the family dynamics that played out at more central tables. Jessica's family occupied the prime seating near the head table, engaging in animated conversations and frequent laughter that created a warm, inclusive atmosphere. My own parents sat with Jessica's parents at what was clearly designated as the family table, though I noticed they seemed somewhat subdued compared to their usual social demeanor. I wondered if they were uncomfortable with my obvious exclusion, or if they too had concluded that my career choices made me difficult to accommodate in family celebrations. The dinner service proceeded smoothly, with perfectly prepared salmon and vegetarian options that reflected Jessica's attention to dietary preferences. The speeches began with Tyler's best man toast, which struck the perfect balance between humor and sentiment, as he recounted stories of Michael's dating disasters before finding his perfect match. Rachel's maid of honor speech was equally well crafted, celebrating Jessica's loyalty, creativity, and capacity for making everyone around her feel valued and loved. Throughout these toasts, I found myself thinking about the relationships I had sacrificed for my career, the friends who had stopped inviting me to gatherings because I canceled so frequently, the romantic relationships that had ended when partners decided they needed someone more available and emotionally present. The loneliness that I usually managed to ignore during busy workdays felt particularly acute, surrounded by celebrations of love and commitment. As the evening progressed, I began to consider leaving early, slipping away during the dancing portion of the reception when my absence would be less noticeable. My presence clearly wasn't adding to anyone's enjoyment of the celebration, and staying felt like subjecting myself to unnecessary emotional pain. I could drive home, order takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, and spend the evening reading medical journals in the comfort of my own space. But just as I was gathering my purse and preparing to make quiet excuses to my table mates, the microphone crackled to life again. Robert Martinez, Jessica's father, stood up at the family table, looking distinguished in his navy suit as he prepared to give the traditional father of the bride speech. The reception hall gradually quieted as guests turned their attention toward him, wine glasses in hand as they anticipated his words about his daughter's happiness and future. What happened next would transform not only that evening, but my entire understanding of my place in both my chosen profession and my family relationships. Robert began speaking about gratitude, about the many people who had contributed to Jessica's ability to reach this joyful moment in her life. His voice carried the emotion of a father sending his beloved daughter into a new chapter, but there was something else in his tone, something that made me pay closer attention despite my plans to leave. As his speech continued, Robert's eyes began scanning the reception hall, moving systematically from table to table as if he was looking for someone specific. When his gaze reached the back corner where I sat partially hidden behind the decorated concrete pillar, his expression changed dramatically. The prepared speech seemed to falter as recognition dawned across his features, and suddenly every person in that reception hall was about to learn something that would change everything. Robert Martinez set down his champagne glass with trembling hands, his prepared speech forgotten as he stared directly at me across the crowded reception hall. The murmur of conversation that had continued during the early moments of his toast gradually faded as guests noticed his sudden pause and the intensity of his gaze fixed on something behind them. I felt heat rise to my cheeks as hundreds of eyes began turning to follow his line of sight, searching for whatever had captured the father of the bride's attention so completely. My instinct was to shrink further behind the concrete pillar, to somehow disappear entirely from this moment that felt increasingly charged with significance I couldn't understand. Robert's voice, when he resumed speaking, carried a different quality entirely from the warm, paternal tone he had used moments before. There was something raw and emotional, almost reverent, that made every person in the reception hall lean forward with attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "I need to pause my prepared remarks because I've just realized something extraordinary. 2 years ago, my life changed forever in ways I never thought I'd have the chance to acknowledge publicly." The silence in the room became absolute, even the catering staff stopping their quiet movements to listen. Jessica looked puzzled, glancing between her father and the direction of his gaze with growing concern. Michael's expression showed similar confusion, his hand reaching for Jessica's as if to anchor himself during this unexpected turn. Robert stepped away from the family table, moving closer to the center of the reception hall where his voice would carry clearly to every corner. His construction worker's build seemed somehow more dignified in his formal suit, his weathered hands clasped in front of him as he searched for words to explain what was happening. On March 15th, 2022, I was working a job site downtown when I felt what I thought was the worst heartburn of my life, he continued, his eyes never leaving mine despite the distance between us. The pain was so intense I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except pray that someone would help me. I felt my own breathing become shallow as the memory of that day flooded back with startling clarity. March 15th had been one of the most challenging days of my career, a shift that had tested every skill I had developed over years of training and practice. I remembered the emergency call, the frantic ambulance ride, the desperate race against time that had followed. The paramedics told me later that I was clinically dead for 4 minutes, Robert said, his voice stronger now as he found his rhythm. My heart had stopped completely, and they couldn't get it started again. By the time they got me to St. Mary's Medical Center, my wife Carmen was being prepared for the possibility that she might be planning a funeral instead of our daughter's wedding. Carmen Martinez's face had gone pale, her hand pressed to her throat as she relived what must have been the most terrifying experience of her life. I could see other guests beginning to understand the direction of Robert's speech, though few had yet connected it to my presence at the back of the room. But God had other plans, Robert continued, his voice rising with conviction. Because on that day, at that hospital, there was a surgeon who refused to give up on a stranger's life. Someone who spent 7 hours fighting to repair the damage to my heart, who used skills I can't even comprehend to quite literally bring me back from the dead. The reception hall had become so quiet, I could hear the distant sound of traffic. On the nearby highway, the gentle rustle of evening breeze through the garden landscaping outside. Every person in that room was holding their breath, waiting for Robert to complete the connection they were beginning to sense. I never got to thank that surgeon properly, Robert said, taking another step forward, his gaze still locked on mine. The recovery period was intense, and by the time I was well enough to ask questions, I was told that Dr. Chen had moved on to other cases, other patients who needed her expertise just as desperately as I had. The sound of my name rippling through the reception hall was like a stone dropped into still water, creating expanding circles of recognition and understanding. I felt simultaneously exposed and invisible, acknowledged yet somehow separate from the drama unfolding around. Jessica's eyes widened as she processed what her father was revealing, her gaze swinging between Robert and me with dawning comprehension. Michael looked equally stunned, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been pride as he began to understand the full significance of what was happening. Dr. Emily Chen, Robert said, his voice now carrying across the reception hall with absolute clarity, is sitting right there, behind that pillar, at a table in the back of this room. The woman who saved my life, who made it possible for me to walk my daughter down the aisle today, who gave me the chance to see Jessica graduate from dental hygiene school and find the love of her life. The silence that followed his words was electric, charged with emotions too complex for most people to process immediately. I felt hundreds of eyes turning toward me, examining this person they had barely noticed, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in the sage green dress with the life-saving surgeon their host was describing. Robert began walking toward my table, navigating between the round dining tables with determined purpose. His movement seemed to break the spell that had held the reception hall in suspended animation, and guests began shifting in their seats, murmuring to each other as they processed this unexpected revelation. I remember very little about that day, Robert continued as he approached, his voice now directed more toward me than to the larger audience. But I remember a voice in the recovery room, a woman's voice, telling me that the surgery had been successful, that I was going to be fine, that I needed to focus on healing so I could get back to the people who loved me. I found myself standing, without conscious decision, my legs unsteady as Robert reached my table. The other guests at my table had moved back slightly, giving us space for this moment that felt both intensely private and utterly public. "Dr. Chen," Robert said, extending his hand toward me with the same reverence some people reserve for religious moments. "I have been hoping for 2 years that I would find a way to thank you properly for giving me my life back. I never imagined that opportunity would come at my daughter's wedding, but perhaps that's exactly as it should be." I took his offered hand, feeling the calloused strength of fingers that had spent decades building things, creating structures that would shelter families and provide foundations for communities. There was something profound about this connection, between his hands that built and mine that healed, between his labor that created homes and my work that preserved the hearts that made those homes meaningful. "Mr. Martinez," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper in the intense quiet of the reception hall. "I remember you. You were so concerned about missing your daughter's graduation, about whether you'd be able to walk her down the aisle. Someday. I'm so glad to see that you made it to both." The emotion that crossed Robert's face was raw and immediate, tears forming in his eyes as he processed the fact that I had remembered his fears from that terrifying day. Around us, the reception hall remained absolutely silent. Every guest absorbed in this moment of recognition and gratitude playing out before them. "You remember," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "After everything you must see, all the patients you must treat, you remember what I was worried about." "I remember all of my patients," I replied honestly. "But I especially remember the ones who fight the hardest to get back to the people they love. Your recovery was remarkable because you were so determined to be here for Jessica." Jessica herself had risen from the head table and was moving toward us, tears streaming down her face as she began to understand the full magnitude of what was being revealed. The beautiful bride who had seemed so composed throughout the ceremony now looked vulnerable and overwhelmed, processing the realization that her father's life had been saved by the woman her family had spent months treating as an unwelcome outsider. "Emily," Jessica said when she reached us, her voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. Daddy never told us your name, just that a wonderful surgeon had saved his life. We knew he wanted to find you and thank you, but the hospital couldn't provide contact information because of privacy policies." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. For months, Jessica's family had viewed me as someone whose priorities were skewed, whose dedication to her career made her unsuitable as a true family member. Meanwhile, unknown to any of us, that same career dedication had been responsible for preserving the man who would become my daughter-in-law's father, ensuring that this very wedding could take place. Carmen Martinez had joined our growing circle, her face wet with tears as she looked at me with an expression of wonder and gratitude. This woman who had questioned my commitment to family values was now face to face with the person who had made it possible for her family to remain intact. "How do you thank someone for giving you back your husband?" Carmen asked, her voice barely audible. How do you express gratitude for something that valuable? Before I could respond, Michael appeared at my side, his arm sliding around my shoulders in a gesture of support and solidarity. My little brother, who had spent recent months trying to navigate between his loyalty to me and his desire to please his new in-laws, now stood proudly beside me as the full scope of my contribution to his bride's family became clear. "This is why she misses family dinners," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. "This is why she can't commit to social events or plan vacations months in advance. Because somewhere in this city, there's always someone, like Mr. Martinez, whose life depends on her being available when crisis strikes." The reception hall had become a living tableau, guests frozen in various stages of processing this dramatic revelation. Some were crying openly, moved by the powerful demonstration of how interconnected our lives can be in ways we never realize. Others looked stunned, trying to reconcile their assumptions about work-life balance with the reality of life and death responsibility that some professions carry. Robert released my hand only to embrace me in a hug that felt like forgiveness for every family gathering I had missed, every phone call I had cut short, every moment when my professional obligations had taken precedence over social expectations. In his arms, I felt acknowledged not just as a skilled surgeon, but as someone whose sacrifices had meaning beyond my own career advancement. "I need everyone in this room to understand something," Robert said, stepping back but keeping his hands on my shoulders as he addressed the assembled guests. "Dr. Chen didn't just save my life that day. She gave my wife her husband back, my children their father, my grandchildren their abuelo. She made it possible for Jessica to have me walk her down the aisle, for all of us to be celebrating together tonight." The applause that began was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It started slowly, a few guests clapping with genuine appreciation, then built to encompass the entire reception hall. People were standing now, their applause accompanied by cheers and expressions of amazement at the dramatic turn the evening had taken. But the most meaningful response came from my own parents, David and Linda Chen, who had risen from their seats at the family table and were making their way toward me with expressions of pride and understanding that I had rarely seen directed at my career choices. For years, they had worried that my dedication to surgery was preventing me from building the kind of life they valued, the kind of life that brought families together, rather than keeping them apart. "Our daughter," my father said when he reached our group, his accented English carrying clearly in the reception hall despite his typically quiet demeanor. "We are so proud of our daughter." My mother's embrace was fierce and apologetic, her small frame shaking with emotion as she held me tight. "We didn't understand," she whispered in my ear. "We thought you were choosing work over family, but you were choosing to save families like ours." The evening that had begun with me feeling excluded and undervalued had transformed into something extraordinary. The concrete pillar that had hidden me from the main celebration now seemed symbolic of how my contributions had been invisible to the people I most wanted to impress, until circumstances revealed their true magnitude. Jessica took my hands in hers, her wedding makeup streaked with tears but her smile radiant with newfound understanding. "Emily, I owe you the biggest apology. We've been so wrong about you, about what matters to you, about why you make the choices you do. You didn't just save my father's life, you saved our entire family's future happiness." The reception continued, with a completely different energy, transformed from a celebration that had made me feel like an outsider into a recognition of interconnection and gratitude that I could never have anticipated. Guests approached throughout the evening to express their amazement at the revelation, to share their own stories of medical emergencies and the healthcare professionals who had made differences in their lives. But more than the public recognition, what moved me most was the shift in how Jessica's extended family interacted with me. Abuela Sofia, who had lectured me about family loyalty, now insisted I sit beside her so she could hold my hand while sharing stories of her own immigration journey and the doctors who had helped her family navigate healthcare challenges in a new country. Jessica's aunts and cousins, who had seemed politely distant during previous gatherings, now engaged with genuine warmth and curiosity about my work and experiences. The evening that had threatened to confirm my worst fears about my place in the family structure instead became a powerful demonstration of how our individual contributions ripple outward in ways we rarely get to witness. The missed family dinners, the canceled social plans, the professional obligations that had seemed to create distance between me and the people I loved, all of it was recontextualized through Robert Martinez's survival and presence at his daughter's wedding. As the reception wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I found myself surrounded by people who now saw me not as someone whose priorities were questionable, but as someone whose dedication had made their own happiness possible. The transformation felt almost surreal, like stepping through a mirror into a world where my choices were finally understood and valued. The days following Michael and Jessica's wedding brought unexpected changes that rippled through every aspect of my life. Word of what had happened at the reception spread quickly through both families and professional circles, creating conversations and connections I never could have anticipated. Dr. Patricia Williams called me into her office on Monday morning, not for the performance review I initially feared, but to share something remarkable that had reached her through the hospital's administrative network. Robert Martinez had contacted St. Mary's Medical Center the day after the wedding, requesting to speak with someone about establishing a patient recognition program that would help surgical teams understand the long-term impact of their work. He wants to create a system where patients can share their recovery stories with the medical teams who treated them, Dr. Williams explained, her expression reflecting genuine admiration for the initiative. He believes that surgeons and nurses rarely get to see the full scope of how their work transforms lives, because once patients recover, they typically move on without maintaining contact with their healthcare providers. The concept fascinated me because it addressed something I had experienced throughout my career without fully articulating. Medicine can feel emotionally isolating precisely because we deal with people during their most vulnerable moments, then send them back to their lives without learning how their stories continue. We see the immediate success or failure of procedures, but rarely witness the weddings, graduations, and family celebrations that our interventions make possible. Robert's proposal involved creating a structured way for recovered patients to reconnect with their medical teams, sharing updates about their lives and expressing gratitude in ways that could help healthcare professionals understand the broader meaning of their work. The program would be voluntary and carefully managed to protect patient privacy while providing meaningful connection opportunities. I think this could be particularly valuable for our cardiac surgery department, Dr. Williams continued. The emotional toll of your specialty is enormous, and anything that helps you and your colleagues remember why you chose this work could be incredibly beneficial for preventing burnout and maintaining perspective. I found myself thinking about Sandra Walsh, the woman whose 12-hour surgery I had performed just before the wedding. She was recovering well according to her follow-up reports, but I had no idea how her return to health was affecting her family, her relationship with her son, her plans for the future. The thought of someday hearing from her about attending her son's graduation or celebrating anniversaries we had made possible filled me with anticipation. The conversation with Dr. Williams also revealed something I hadn't expected. My colleagues in the cardiac surgery department had noticed my absence from the hospital over the weekend, which was unusual enough to generate discussion. When they learned about the wedding revelation and its impact, several of them shared similar experiences of feeling disconnected from the human stories behind their medical interventions. Dr. Michael Foster, a senior cardiothoracic surgeon who had mentored me during my fellowship, admitted that he sometimes struggled with the emotional isolation that came with our specialty. We see people at their worst moments, perform procedures that require absolute focus and technical precision, then send them back to lives we rarely get to witness, he said during our department meeting. It's easy to lose sight of why this work matters beyond the technical challenges. The wedding revelation had reminded my entire department about the profound human connections underlying their technical expertise. Colleagues began sharing stories of unexpected encounters with former patients, moments when they had discovered the lasting impact of procedures they had performed years earlier. These conversations created a sense of renewed purpose that was palpable throughout our unit. Meanwhile, my relationship with Jessica's family was undergoing a complete transformation. Carmen Martinez called me on Tuesday evening, her voice warm and welcoming in ways I had never experienced before. She wanted to invite me to Sunday dinner at their house, not as a formal obligation, but as a genuine gesture of inclusion and gratitude. "I've been thinking about all the conversations we've had over the past year," Carmen said, her tone reflecting genuine remorse. "I realize now that when I questioned your work-life balance, I was applying standards that don't make sense for someone in your profession. I was judging you based on my own experiences rather than trying to understand the demands of saving lives." Her invitation to Sunday dinner represented more than just a meal. It was an acknowledgement that I belonged in their family circle not despite my career dedication, but because of the values that dedication represented. The work that had seemed to create distance between us was now recognized as an expression of the same compassion and commitment they valued in their own family relationships. The dinner itself, held the following Sunday, was unlike any family gathering I had experienced with the Martinez family. Instead of feeling like an outsider trying to prove my worthiness, I was welcomed as someone whose contributions were already understood and appreciated. Robert insisted I sit beside him at the head of the table, treating me with the respect typically reserved for honored guests rather than in-laws under evaluation. The conversation flowed naturally around topics related to my work, with family, members asking thoughtful questions about cardiac surgery, the challenges of medical training, and the emotional aspects of dealing with life and death situations. Carmen shared stories about her own work in healthcare administration, drawing connections between our different roles in serving patients and families during medical crises. Most significantly, Abuela Sofia pulled me aside after dinner to offer an apology that felt particularly meaningful, given her earlier criticism of my family priorities. "Misha," she said, using the affectionate term she typically reserved for her biological granddaughters. "I spoke from ignorance when I questioned your loyalty to family. Now I understand that your work is about protecting all families, including ours." Her words carried special weight because they came from someone whose life experiences had taught her to value family connections above almost everything else. For her to recognize that my professional dedication was actually an expression of family values, rather than a rejection of them, felt like receiving blessing from a respected elder. The conversation with Abuela Sofia led to deeper discussions about the different ways people serve their communities and express love for others. She shared stories about her own mother, who had worked as a midwife in rural Mexico, helping bring children safely into the world despite having no formal medical training. The parallels between her mother's dedication to preserving life and my own career path created a bridge of understanding that transcended cultural and generational differences. These family conversations also revealed information that helped me understand the dynamics that had developed around my relationship with Jessica's family. Robert explained that his heart attack had been traumatic for the entire extended family, creating anxiety about mortality and the fragility of their close-knit relationships. My absence from family gatherings had triggered fears that I might not be available if they needed support during future crises. "We didn't understand that your work meant you were always available for the most important kind of support," Robert said during one of these conversations. "We thought you were choosing career over family, when actually you were choosing to be the person families like ours turn to when everything else fails." This reframing of my career choices had implications beyond just my relationship with Jessica's family. It began to change how I viewed my own life balance and the sacrifices I had made for my profession. Rather than seeing missed social events as failures to maintain relationships, I could understand them as necessary components of a calling that served the broader community in essential ways. The shift in perspective also affected my relationship with Michael. who had spent months trying to navigate between loyalty to me and desire to maintain harmony with his new in-laws. The wedding revelation had eliminated the need for this diplomatic balancing act, allowing him to feel proud of his sister's accomplishments without worrying about family disapproval. "I always admired what you do," Michael told me during a coffee meeting the week after the wedding, "but I sometimes felt like I had to downplay it to keep peace with Jessica's family. Now I can talk about your work the way I've always wanted to, as something extraordinary that makes a real difference in the world." This validation from my younger brother meant more to me than I had realized it would. Michael's opinion had always mattered because he knew me before I became Dr. Chen, when I was just Emily, who rescued injured animals and dreamed of helping people. His recognition that my professional identity was consistent with the compassionate person I had always been felt like reconciliation between different aspects of myself. The changes weren't limited to family relationships. Colleagues at the hospital began approaching me with questions about work-life balance, career sustainability, and the emotional challenges of cardiac surgery. The wedding story had somehow become a symbol of how medical professionals' personal sacrifices create value that extends far beyond their immediate patients. Dr. Sarah Kim, a young resident in our department, asked to meet with me specifically to discuss how to maintain relationships while pursuing demanding surgical careers. She was engaged to be married and worried about the impact her training schedule might have on her fiancé and future family planning. "I've been struggling with guilt about missing important events," she admitted during our conversation. "My fiancé is understanding, but his family questions whether I'm really committed to our relationship if I can't prioritize his sister's baby shower or his cousin's graduation party." Her concerns were so familiar, they could have been my own thoughts from just weeks earlier. I found myself able to offer perspective based on recent experiences that had taught me about the difference between being absent and being unavailable when it truly mattered. "The question isn't whether you'll miss some social events," I told her. "The question is whether the people you love understand that your work serves a purpose larger than individual convenience. When they see that your dedication to medicine is an expression of the same values they care about, caring for others, protecting families, fighting for life, then your choices make sense within the context of your relationships." These mentoring conversations with younger physicians reminded me how the wedding revelation had provided not just personal validation, but professional clarity about the meaning and purpose of medical careers. The recognition I had received from Robert Martinez represented acknowledgement that surgical training and practice, despite their personal costs, serve essential human needs that justify their demands. The patient recognition program that Robert had proposed began taking shape. Through collaborative meetings between his advocacy efforts and the hospital's Patient Services Administration, the program would create structured opportunities for recovered patients to reconnect with their medical teams, sharing updates about their lives and expressing gratitude in ways that would help healthcare professionals understand the lasting impact of their work. Initial pilot programs were planned for the cardiac surgery and emergency medicine departments, both specialties where life-saving interventions create dramatic before and after stories that could benefit from long-term follow-up connections. The program would include written updates, optional in-person meetings, and annual recognition events where patients could share their recovery stories with the medical teams who had treated them. "We want to create a bridge between the technical aspects of medical care and the human stories that give that care meaning," Robert explained during one of our planning meetings. "Healthcare professionals need to see that their work creates possibilities for joy, celebration, and continued family connections." The program represented something larger than just patient appreciation. It was an acknowledgement that medical careers involve sacrifices that serve the broader community in ways that deserve recognition and support. By helping healthcare professionals see the long-term impact of their work, the program could help prevent burnout and maintain the sense of purpose that draws people to medicine in the first place. As these various changes unfolded in my professional and personal life, I began to understand that the wedding revelation had created more than just a moment of recognition. It had established new frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual career choices and community service, between personal sacrifice and family values, between being absent from social events and being available for life and death emergencies. The transformation felt particularly significant because it hadn't required me to change my priorities or modify my dedication to cardiac surgery. Instead, it had created contexts where other people could understand and appreciate choices I had been making all along. The validation came not from compromising my professional commitments, but from having those commitments recognized as expressions of the values everyone claimed to share. This shift in perspective was already beginning to influence decisions about my future career path and personal relationships. For the first time in years, I could imagine building a romantic relationship with someone who understood that my work schedule wasn't a rejection of partnership, but a commitment to serving others that deserved support rather than resentment. I could envision family gatherings where my occasional absences were understood as necessary rather than disappointing, where my contributions were measured by their impact rather than my physical presence. The changes also extended to my relationship with my parents, who had begun expressing pride in my career choices with a confidence they had never shown before. The wedding revelation had helped them understand that their daughter's dedication to surgery was consistent with the values they had instilled about serving others and contributing to community welfare. "We always taught you to help people," my mother said during a recent phone conversation. "But we didn't understand that helping people sometimes means missing family dinners. Now we see that your work is how you honor what we taught you about caring for others." This parental recognition felt like receiving permission to be fully myself without apology or compromise. The guilt I had carried about disappointing my parents through my career choices dissolved into pride about honoring their values through my professional dedication. 6 months after Michael and Jessica's wedding, I stood in the St. Mary's Medical Center conference room, watching dozens of former cardiac patients file in with their families for what had become known as the Second Chance celebration. The room buzzed with excitement and anticipation as people who had once fought for their lives in our operating rooms now gathered to share stories of recovery, achievement, and dreams fulfilled. The transformation from that humiliating evening behind the concrete pillar to this moment of professional and personal validation still felt surreal. What had begun as Robert Martinez's desire to thank his surgical team had evolved into a comprehensive program that was revolutionizing how our hospital approached patient care and physician well-being. Margaret Thompson arrived early, as had become her habit for these quarterly gatherings. At 76, she moved with energy that belied her years, her silver hair styled in elegant waves, and her bright blue dress reflecting the vibrant personality that had emerged during her recovery. She spotted me immediately and made her way over with the determined stride of someone who had important news to share. "Dr. Chen, you won't believe what's happened since our last meeting," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Remember how I told you about learning watercolor painting? Well, I've just had my first art exhibition at the community center. And guess what sold first? A painting of the hospital where you saved my life, titled, 'Where Miracles Happen.'" Margaret's artistic success represented something far beyond personal achievement. Her painting had been purchased by another cardiac patient's family, who wanted to donate it back to the hospital as a symbol of hope for future patients. The artwork now hung in our cardiac surgery waiting room, where families could see a former patient's creative interpretation of the place where they were experiencing their own medical crisis. "But that's not even the best part," Margaret continued, reaching into her purse to pull out a photograph. "This is my great-granddaughter, Elena. She was born 3 weeks ago, and I was there for the delivery. Her parents asked me to be her madrina, her godmother, because they said I'm the family member who understands best how precious life is." The photograph showed Margaret holding a tiny infant, both of them surrounded by multiple generations of family members celebrating the newest addition. The joy on Margaret's face reflected not just grandmother's pride, but the profound gratitude of someone who understood that being present for this moment had required surviving a life-threatening cardiac emergency 2 years earlier. Every time I hold Elena, I think about that day when you told me the surgery was successful, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. You probably don't remember because you see so many patients, but you said something that has stayed with me every single day since then. I found myself leaning forward, curious about what words could have carried such lasting impact during what was undoubtedly a routine post-operative conversation for me. You said, "Mrs. Thompson, you fought hard to stay with us during that surgery, and now you get to find out what wonderful things are waiting for you on the other side of this recovery." I had no idea then what those wonderful things would be, but Elena is definitely one of them. Margaret's story exemplified the profound disconnect that had existed in my understanding of medical practice before the patient recognition program began. I had viewed her valve replacement surgery primarily through technical and clinical lenses, measuring success by immediate post-operative outcomes and short-term recovery statistics. The idea that her procedure had enabled her to become a great-grandmother, an artist, a godmother to her great-granddaughter, and a source of inspiration for other cardiac patients had never entered my professional calculations. James Rodriguez appeared next to us, overhearing the end of Margaret's story while waiting his turn to share updates about his own recovery journey. The 39-year-old high school teacher looked robust and energetic, his complexion healthy, and his demeanor confident in ways that contrasted dramatically with my memories of his preoperative condition. "Dr. Chen, I brought someone special to meet you today," James said, gesturing toward a teenage girl who had been hanging back politely while Margaret and I talked. "This is my daughter, Sophia. She's a senior this year, and she has some news she's wanted to share with you personally." Sophia Rodriguez stepped forward with the poise of someone accustomed to academic achievement and public speaking. She was clearly her father's daughter, with the same warm eyes and genuine smile that had made James such a beloved teacher among his students. "Dr. Chen, my dad has talked about you so much over the past 2 years that I feel like I already know you," Sophia said, extending her hand with mature confidence. "He tells all his students about the day you saved his life and how that experience taught him that there are people in our community whose job is to fight for others when everything seems hopeless." James beamed with paternal pride as his daughter continued her prepared remarks. "Because of his stories about your dedication and skill, I've decided to pursue pre-med studies at Oregon Health and Science University next fall. I want to become a cardiac surgeon like you, so I can help other families stay together the way you helped ours." The impact of Sophia's announcement hit me with unexpected force. James's bypass surgery, which I had performed during a particularly busy week 2 years earlier, had not only preserved his life, but had apparently inspired his daughter to pursue the same medical specialty that had saved her father. The ripple effects of a single surgical procedure were extending into the next generation in ways I could never have anticipated. "My dad always says that you didn't just repair his heart, you gave our whole family a future," Sophia continued. "My little brother was only 8 when Dad had his heart attack, and he doesn't really remember how scared we all were. But I was 15, and I remember thinking that our family might never be the same. Because of what you did, my brother has gotten to grow up with his father's guidance, and I've gotten to see what it means to dedicate your life to serving others." James placed a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of a parent, whose near-death experience had shaped his child's life direction in profound ways. "Sophia has been volunteering at the Children's Hospital since she turned 16, he explained. "She says that seeing you work with such skill and compassion showed her what she wants to do with her life." The conversation with Sophia and James was interrupted by the arrival of Sandra Walsh, whose recovery story had become legendary among both medical staff and former patients in the cardiac surgery program. Sandra entered the conference room with characteristic energy, followed by her husband Mike and their son David, now 20 and home from college for the celebration. "Dr. Chen, I hope you have time to hear about the latest developments in the Walsh family adventure, Sandra called out as she approached our growing group, because the news just keeps getting better. Sandra's transformation over the past 2 years had been remarkable, not just medically, but personally and professionally. Her brush with mortality during the 12-hour surgery that had kept me away from Michael's rehearsal dinner had catalyzed changes throughout her family that continued to unfold in surprising directions. You remember how I told you about starting the Hart Family Support Network? Sandra said, referring to the nonprofit organization she had established to help families navigate cardiac emergencies. Well, we've just received our biggest grant yet from the Oregon Community Foundation. We're expanding statewide, and we're hiring our first full-time staff members. The Hart Family Support Network had grown from Sandra's desire to help other families avoid the confusion and fear that had characterized her own medical crisis. The organization provided practical support during cardiac emergencies, including hospital navigation assistance, temporary childcare coordination, meal delivery services, and emotional support from other families who had experienced similar challenges. But the really exciting news is about David, Sandra continued, gesturing toward her son, who had grown into a confident young man with his mother's determined expression and his father's gentle demeanor. Tell Dr. Chen about your summer internship. David Walsh stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who had watched his family transform crisis into opportunity. Dr. Chen, I'm going to be working in your cardiac surgery department this summer as a pre-med intern, he announced. I've been accepted into the hospital's undergraduate research program, and I'll be studying patient outcomes and family support systems. The symmetry of David's internship placement felt almost too perfect to be coincidental. The son of a patient whose life I had saved would now be working alongside me, studying the very systems that had preserved his family's integrity and inspired his career direction. His research would focus on the relationship between surgical outcomes and family support networks, examining how programs like his mother's nonprofit organization might improve both patient recovery and family well-being. David's undergraduate thesis is going to analyze the data from our patient recognition program, Sandra explained. He wants to quantify the impact that connecting surgeons with long-term patient outcomes has on physician satisfaction and career sustainability. The academic rigor that David was bringing to evaluating our patient recognition program reflected the sophistication that had developed around what began as Robert Martinez's simple desire to thank his surgical team. The program was now being studied by healthcare researchers across the country as a potential model for addressing physician burnout while improving patient satisfaction and treatment compliance. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been observing these patient interactions from across the room, approached our group with a folder of documents that I recognized as containing the latest statistical analyses of the program's outcomes. Her expression reflected the satisfaction of a department head whose innovative initiative was producing measurable benefits for both patients and healthcare providers. Emily, I wanted to share these numbers with you while our former patients are here to see them, Dr. Williams said, opening the folder to reveal charts and graphs documenting the program's impact. The results continue to exceed our most optimistic projections. The statistical improvements were impressive across multiple measures of both patient and provider satisfaction. Patient compliance with post-operative care instructions had increased by 42% since the recognition program began, with former patients reporting that ongoing connections with their medical teams motivated them to maintain heart-healthy lifestyles and attend follow-up appointments consistently. Physician satisfaction scores had improved even more dramatically, with reported symptoms of burnout decreasing by 36% among cardiac surgery staff who participated regularly in patient recognition events. Most significantly, retention rates among surgical residents and fellows had improved markedly, with exit interviews indicating that connections with long-term patient outcomes provided powerful motivation for sustaining demanding medical careers. We're also seeing improvements in surgical outcomes that we think might be related to physician morale and job satisfaction, Dr. Williams continued. When healthcare providers feel connected to the human impact of their work, they bring enhanced focus and dedication to their clinical responsibilities. The data confirmed what I had been experiencing personally since the patient recognition program began. Understanding the long-term impact of surgical interventions provided renewed sense of purpose that sustained me through the emotional and physical demands of cardiac surgery. Knowing that Margaret Thompson was creating art, that James Rodriguez was inspiring students, that Sandra Walsh was building support networks for other families, transformed routine medical procedures into meaningful contributions to community well-being. Robert Martinez entered the conference room just as Dr. Williams was sharing the latest program statistics, his timing perfect as always for moments when his presence would have maximum impact. Over the past year, Robert had become the volunteer, coordinator for the patient recognition program, dedicating significant time and energy to expanding its reach and effectiveness. Dr. Chen, I have some news that I think will interest everyone here, Robert announced, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone accustomed to managing construction sites and coordinating complex projects. The American Heart Association has officially endorsed our patient recognition program as a national model for improving both patient outcomes and physician well-being. The endorsement from a major professional organization represented validation that our local initiative had broader significance for the healthcare community. The program that had grown from Robert's gratitude about attending Jessica's wedding was now being recommended to cardiac surgery departments across the United States as an evidence-based approach to addressing industry-wide challenges. But that's not all, Robert continued, his expression reflecting excitement about additional developments. The Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations wants to incorporate patient recognition programs into their standards for hospital accreditation. Healthcare systems that implement these programs will receive preferential scoring during their accreditation reviews. The regulatory endorsement meant that patient recognition programs would likely become standard practice throughout American healthcare, transforming what had begun as a local innovation into national policy. The influence of our program would extend far beyond St. Mary's Medical Center, potentially affecting thousands of healthcare providers and patients across the country. Carmen Martinez had accompanied her husband to the celebration, and she approached me with the warm smile that had replaced her earlier skepticism about my work-life balance priorities. Over the past year, Carmen had become one of the most vocal advocates for understanding the demands of medical careers and supporting healthcare professionals' dedication to their work. "Emily, I have a confession to make," Carmen said, her tone reflecting both humor and genuine remorse. "Before Robert's surgery, I used to judge doctors who seemed too focused on their careers. I thought you were all cold and disconnected from normal family values. Now, I understand that your focus on work is actually an expression of the deepest family values, protecting everyone's ability to stay together." Carmen's transformation in understanding medical careers had extended to her work in healthcare administration, where she had become an advocate for policies that supported healthcare providers' professional dedication while recognizing the personal sacrifices required by life-saving careers. She had recently been promoted to Director of Patient Services at her pediatric practice, largely based on her insights about the relationship between provider well-being and patient care quality. "I've been thinking about starting a support group for families of healthcare professionals," Carmen continued. "So many spouses and children don't understand why medical careers require such irregular schedules and emotional demands. I want to help them see what I learned about the importance of supporting rather than resenting professional dedication." The support group concept represented another evolution of the patient recognition program's core principles. Just as connecting healthcare providers with long-term patient outcomes improved physician satisfaction and career sustainability, educating healthcare families about the broader purpose of medical work could strengthen personal relationships while supporting professional excellence. Jessica and Michael arrived at the celebration with news that had been anticipated for months, but still generated excitement throughout our extended family network. Jessica's pregnancy was progressing beautifully, and they had recently learned they were expecting a daughter who would be born in early autumn. "Emily, we have something important to ask you," Jessica said, her radiant smile reflecting the joy of expectant parenthood combined with the gratitude that had characterized our relationship since the wedding revelation. "We know this might seem presumptuous, but we can't imagine anyone we'd rather have as our daughter's godmother." The invitation to serve as godmother represented the ultimate recognition of my place in their family structure. From being seated behind a concrete pillar at their wedding, to being asked to play a central role in their child's spiritual and emotional development felt like a transformation that still seemed almost miraculous. "We want our daughter to grow up understanding that there are people in this world whose job is to fight for life when everything seems hopeless," Michael added, echoing the language that James Rodriguez used when describing my work to his students. "We want her to see you as an example of what it means to dedicate your life to serving others." The godmother invitation also represented practical recognition of how my relationship with Jessica's family had evolved. Carmen and Robert now viewed me not as someone whose career choices made me unsuitable for family involvement, but as someone whose professional dedication qualified me to provide guidance and support for their future grandchild. As the patient, recognition celebration continued throughout the afternoon. I found myself reflecting on the cascade of changes that had originated from that moment of public recognition at Michael and Jessica's wedding. What had begun as Robert Martinez's desire to thank his surgical team had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how I understood professional purpose, personal relationships, and the integration of career dedication with family involvement. The changes extended far beyond my immediate personal circumstances. The patient recognition program was influencing healthcare policy at national levels. Young medical students were learning new models for sustaining career satisfaction while maintaining personal relationships. Families of healthcare professionals were developing better understanding of how to support, rather than resent, professional dedication to life-saving work. Dr. Alex Chen, whom I had been dating for 4 months, arrived at the celebration after finishing his shift in the emergency department at Portland General Hospital. Our relationship had developed naturally around shared understanding of medical careers and mutual respect for the demands of life-saving professions. Alex brought unique perspective to our relationship because he had witnessed the patient recognition program's development from the beginning, having attended several events as an interested observer considering similar initiatives for emergency medicine. "Emily, I've been thinking about what you said last week regarding the difference between being absent and being unavailable," Alex said, as we found a quiet corner of the conference room to talk privately. "Watching how your former patients describe the impact of your work has helped me understand something important about medical relationships." Alex had been struggling with his own family's questions about his dedication to emergency medicine, particularly their concerns about his irregular schedule and the emotional toll of treating trauma cases. His parents, both retired teachers, had difficulty understanding why he couldn't maintain more predictable work hours and seemed constantly exhausted by the demands of his profession. "Your patient recognition program has shown me that the question isn't whether medical careers create challenges for personal relationships," Alex continued. "The question is whether the people in our lives understand that our work serves purposes larger than individual convenience. When they see that our dedication serves values they also care about, they can support our choices instead of resenting them." Alex's insight reflected the broader principles that had emerged from my wedding experience and the subsequent patient recognition program development. Professional dedication and personal fulfillment weren't mutually exclusive when surrounded by people who understood that career choices could serve community purposes that deserved respect and support. Our relationship had been built on this foundation of mutual understanding and support for each other's professional commitments. Instead of competing with my career for attention, Alex appreciated the skills and dedication that made me effective as a cardiac surgeon. Instead of resenting his emergency medicine schedule, I understood that his availability during crisis situations served essential community needs. I have something I want to ask you, Alex said, his expression becoming more serious as he reached into his jacket pocket. I know we've only been dating for 4 months, but I also know that I've never met anyone whose values align so perfectly with mine. The small velvet box he withdrew from his pocket suggested that our conversation was about to take a direction I hadn't anticipated, though perhaps should have expected, given the depth of connection we had developed in such a short time. Prinzi. Medicine physicians and cardiac surgeons shared similar approaches to life and death decision-making, creating natural compatibility in both professional and personal contexts. Emily Chen, will you marry me? Alex asked, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring that reflected his understanding of my preferences for classic rather than ostentatious jewelry. I want to build a life with someone who understands that our work is a calling, not just a career, and who won't ask me to choose between serving others and loving my family. The proposal, delivered in a room full of people whose lives had been saved by medical intervention, felt perfectly appropriate for someone whose identity was so closely connected to healthcare service. Alex had chosen to propose in a setting that celebrated the values we both shared, surrounded by evidence of how medical dedication creates opportunities for others to experience love, family, and celebration. Yes, I said, surprised by how easily the decision came despite the relationship's relatively short duration. Yes, I want to build that life with you. The engagement announcement generated enthusiastic applause from former patients and their families who had been observing our conversation with interest. Margaret Thompson declared that watching her surgeon get engaged at a patient recognition event was the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. James Rodriguez suggested that our wedding should include a ceremony honoring all the patients whose lives had been saved by both emergency medicine and cardiac surgery. As the celebration continued into the evening, with former patients sharing dinner with their medical teams and stories flowing freely between tables, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment of personal and professional fulfillment. The young woman who had been seated behind a concrete pillar, feeling excluded and undervalued, had discovered that her contributions were far more significant than anyone realized. The transformation hadn't required changing my priorities or compromising my dedication to cardiac surgery. It had required finding contexts where other people could understand and appreciate the values that motivated my career choices. The recognition had come not from altering my professional commitments, but from having those commitments understood as expressions of service that deserved support rather than resentment. My relationship with my parents had undergone similar transformation as they began to understand that their daughter's medical career represented the ultimate expression of values they had instilled about helping others and contributing to community welfare. The guilt I had carried about disappointing them through my career choices had dissolved into pride about honoring their teachings through professional dedication. Our daughter has always had a heart for helping people, my mother said during a recent family dinner, using language that acknowledged both my childhood compassion and my adult professional identity. We just didn't understand that helping people sometimes means missing family dinners because someone else's family needs you more urgently. The patient recognition program had continued to evolve and expand beyond its original scope, with new components being added based on feedback from participants and observed outcomes. We had established mentorship programs where recovered patients could offer support to current patients facing similar procedures. We had created educational initiatives where former patients could address medical students about the human impact of healthcare careers. We had developed research protocols to study the relationship between patient connection and physician satisfaction more systematically. Most significantly, the program had inspired similar initiatives in other medical specialties throughout the hospital and beyond. Emergency medicine, oncology, pediatrics, obstetrics, and surgery departments across multiple healthcare systems had developed their own versions of patient recognition events, creating opportunities for healthcare providers to understand the long-term impact of their work across various medical disciplines. The success of these programs had attracted interest from healthcare policy researchers and medical education specialists who were studying the relationship between physician well-being and patient outcomes. Several medical schools had incorporated patient recognition programs into their curricula, ensuring that future physicians would understand the importance of maintaining connections with the human impact of their work. During one particularly memorable speaking engagement at the American Medical Association's annual conference, I was approached by a young emergency medicine resident who had been struggling with doubts about her career choice. The demands of medical training had created tensions in her marriage, and she was questioning whether the personal costs of her profession justified the professional rewards. Your story helped me understand that the question isn't whether my career creates challenges for my personal relationships, she told me after my presentation. The question is whether the people in my life understand that my career serves purposes larger than individual convenience. If they can see that my work serves values they also care about, then they can support my dedication instead of resenting it. Her insight captured the essence of what I had learned through my own journey from professional isolation to integrated personal and professional identity. The transformation hadn't required changing priorities or compromising dedication to medical practice. It had required finding people and contexts where professional commitments were understood as expressions of service rather than obstacles to relationship building. The wedding planning for Alex and me proceeded with the same principles that had guided our relationship development. Instead of viewing our medical careers as complications to work around, we incorporated our professional identities into celebration plans that honored both our individual callings and our shared commitment to healthcare service. We decided to hold our ceremony at the Portland Japanese Garden, a location that reflected both natural beauty and the careful attention to detail that characterized our approach to medical practice. The guest list included former patients from both our practices, along with medical colleagues and family members who had learned to appreciate rather than resent our professional dedication. Robert Martinez offered to coordinate wedding logistics, applying the project management skills he had developed through construction work and patient recognition program administration. Carmen Martinez insisted on handling catering arrangements, drawing on her healthcare administration experience to ensure that dietary restrictions and scheduling conflicts were managed smoothly. Margaret Thompson volunteered to create watercolor paintings that would serve as wedding favors, each piece depicting scenes from the Portland Japanese Garden where our ceremony would take place. Her artistic contribution represented the creative expression that had flourished during her cardiac recovery, made possible by the surgical intervention that had preserved her ability to participate in celebrations like ours. The wedding itself felt like a celebration not just of Alex's and my commitment to each other, but of the broader community of healing and service that had brought us together. Former patients shared stories about how medical intervention had enabled their own marriages, family celebrations, and life achievements. Medical colleagues offered toasts about the importance of finding partners who understood and supported professional dedication to life-saving work. Jessica and Michael attended with their newborn daughter, Elena Rose, whose middle name honored the patient recognition program that had transformed our family relationships. As Elena's godmother, I held her during the reception, thinking about the future celebrations that would be possible because of the medical interventions, family support systems, and community connections that had preserved so many lives in that room. The months following our wedding brought continued expansion of the patient recognition program and its influence on healthcare policy and medical education. The American Heart Association published guidelines recommending patient recognition programs for cardiac surgery departments nationwide. The Joint Commission incorporated patient connection initiatives into their hospital accreditation standards. Medical schools began requiring students to participate in patient follow-up programs as part of their clinical training. My own career had evolved to include speaking engagements, research collaborations, and policy consultation work related to physician well-being and patient outcomes. The wedding story that had initially felt like personal embarrassment had become a teaching tool for healthcare professionals learning to integrate demanding careers with meaningful personal relationships. Alex and I purchased a house in the hills overlooking Portland, with space for home offices where we could pursue research and writing projects related to our shared interests in healthcare improvement and physician satisfaction. The house also included a guest room specifically designed to accommodate visits from former patients and their families, recognizing that our patient recognition work would continue to be an important part of our life together. Sandra Walsh's Heart Families Support Network had expanded statewide and was beginning to develop chapters in other states, with funding from healthcare foundations and government agencies interested in supporting comprehensive approaches to cardiac care. David Walsh had graduated from his internship program and been accepted into medical school, with plans to specialize in cardiac surgery and continue research into patient support systems. Sofia Rodriguez had completed her pre-med studies and been accepted into the same medical school program, with interests in both cardiac surgery and medical education. Her application essay had focused on how her father's surgical experience had influenced her understanding of medicine as both technical expertise and community service. James Rodriguez had been promoted to principal of his high school, where he had established a healthcare careers program that connected students with medical professionals and provided opportunities for hospital volunteering and job shadowing. His classroom had become a regular stop for medical students learning about community engagement and patient advocacy. Margaret Thompson's art had gained recognition beyond our local community, with several pieces featured in exhibitions focused on medical themes and patient experiences. Her painting of the cardiac surgery suite had been reproduced as prints that were sold to benefit patient support programs, creating ongoing fundraising for services that helped other families navigate medical crises. As I reflected on the 3 years that had passed since that transformational evening at Michael and Jessica's wedding, I realized that the most significant change hadn't been in how other people viewed me, but in how I viewed myself and my place in the broader community of healing and service. The recognition I had received had allowed me to stop apologizing for choices that served important purposes, to embrace my professional identity without shame or compromise, and to build relationships with people who appreciated rather than tolerated my dedication to saving lives. The concrete pillar that had hidden me at the wedding reception had become a symbol of how valuable contributions can be invisible until circumstances reveal their significance. My work as a cardiac surgeon had always been meaningful, but it had taken Robert Martinez's public recognition to help my family and community understand the full scope of that meaning. The patient recognition program that grew from his gratitude had created systematic ways for healthcare providers and patients to maintain connections that honored both the technical expertise and human compassion required for medical healing. Looking toward the future, I felt optimistic about possibilities for continuing to grow both personally and professionally from a foundation of authentic self-acceptance and community recognition. The patient recognition program would continue, expanding, potentially influencing healthcare systems internationally. My relationship with Alex provided partnership that supported rather than competed with professional dedication. My connections with extended family had been strengthened through shared understanding of values and service. Most importantly, I had learned that professional dedication and personal fulfillment could enhance rather than limit each other when surrounded by people who understood that meaningful work serves purposes larger than individual achievement. The wedding revelation had taught me that being true to yourself creates opportunities for authentic connections with others who appreciate rather than resent your choices. The young woman who had been seated behind a pillar, feeling excluded and undervalued, had discovered that her contributions were far more significant than anyone realized. Sometimes it takes a moment of dramatic recognition to reveal what was always true. That work performed with dedication and skill creates ripples of impact that extend far beyond our immediate awareness, touching lives and enabling celebrations we may never witness but have helped make possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.